Have you ever thought about joining the Peace Corps? As a former volunteer, I enthusiastically encourage you to do so. Every volunteer has a unique experience, and it's definitely not easy. But for me, my time in Mali as an agricultural volunteer, it opened my eyes and mind to a future I wanted, yet had never known. It inspired me to become an anthropologist, to create a small nonprofit called African Sky, and to find creative and useful ways to sustain my relationships with people and communities in Mali. And you know what? My story isn't unique. So many returned volunteers end up as anthropologists, and if not, their hands-on, embedded participation with their host communities, it makes them honorary anthropologists at the very least. Now, that hands-on experience, that training, it explains why you see so many returned Peace Corps volunteers working in the Department of State and in NGOs and think tanks all throughout the world. Put simply, their Peace Corps experience prepares them to make valuable contributions in the area of international development. Now, international development, it's been a cornerstone of anthropological inquiry for many decades. And in fact, development anthropology, as a specialization, it puts anthropologists on the front lines of international development. Now, development anthropologists, they bring their research to bear on socioeconomic, cultural, ecological, and technical problems around the world. And they collaborate with knowledge experts and communities all over the world in search of practical solutions to human problems. Today, we'll take a close look at development anthropology. First, I'll share some of my field research from Africa, and then we'll look to a pioneer of development anthropology to give us some theoretical grounding. And last, we'll take a look at how anthropologists have thought about international development since World War II. As an anthropologist, I've spent the past couple of decades working with farming communities in Mali, West Africa. And we've done some terrific projects together. But one of my all-time favorites thus far was a cross-generational women's summit that we organized back in 2011. You see, it all started around 5 to 6 years earlier than that when a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali suggested that I travel north to meet someone that he deemed to be my kindred spirit. Well, it was my kindred spirit in terms of community-based research and initiatives. And you know what? I ran to go meet this man, Tamba, in a town called Markala. And I quickly discovered that when it came to assisting people in this community, Tamba was a tireless champion. The first day I met him, we hired a moped taxi to tour 4 different groups that he was mentoring. Now, there was a local self-advocacy group for people with developmental and/or physical disabilities. And there was an amazing women's group led by a retired female physician. Then there was also this bountiful garden managed by a man who gave orphans opportunities to learn how to garden. Then, as I sat eating a delicious plate of rice and peanut sauce with my newfound friend, 2 women from yet a 4th group approached us with a small folder and a proposal. The group they represented included just over a dozen local women of varying levels of literacy and numeracy. And by the time they approached Tamba and I, they were as prepared as any group I've ever worked with in Mali. It turns out that the women had joined together to propose a soap-making venture. They had the predicted expenses, the output, and income. They were intent on saving money by making soap for their households, but they also wanted to make some money by producing surplus soap to sell to friends and neighbors. All they needed was a little help launching their venture. I loved this idea. I mean, I didn't have their full requested budget, but I invested on the spot. And I promised them that I would return in about 6 months to hear their progress. Now, my NGO and I, we weren't teaching them to make soap. We were deeply embedded in Malian communities, and through our social networks and anthropological depth, we positioned ourselves to support a remarkably well-defined local initiative. But that's not all. We invested in these women because they had something to teach us. You see, the moment they placed that first proposal and budget in my hands, I was focused on learning how to replicate their terrific plan across Mali. So, after 6 months, I returned to honor my promise that I would invest a second round of funding. And my single prerequisite was that I wanted to hear how things went, including their figures and results. Now, the group proudly showed their notebook as well as the tin box they used to store common funds. They didn't make a huge profit, but they did make money. I congratulated them, and I pulled out the money I had set aside to double down on our pay-it-forward social investment. But then the celebratory tone, it sharply turned to concern and confusion. They asked me if I understood the notebook they used for their records and accounting. I insisted I did. So why then, they asked me, was I offering more money? They told me to give it to somebody else because they made back their initial investment with profit. Now, this was something I had never heard before. They actually didn't want additional funds. Their model worked right away, and they were building it themselves. A year later, the women, they changed sectors and went into peanut butter production. And you heard that right. They bought large sacks of locally harvested peanuts, and a couple times a month, they spent the afternoon together roasting peanuts over an open flame using a contraption that they had commissioned from a local blacksmith. And while socializing, they then crushed the roasted peanuts into the most absolutely delicious peanut butter that I have ever tasted. The women explained that after a few discussions, they were convinced that making peanut butter, not soap, offered the best return on investment. Now, remember, not all these women were literate, but the project helped spread critical skills among group members. These women continue to make and sell high-quality, nutritionally charged peanut butter among neighbors and other locals. And they've demonstrated their methods for countless visitors, both Malians and Americans. And this is just one development success story I could tell you about. For example, there was another larger group in Markala that focused on training young married women as apprentices. Young women who never got the opportunity to attend or complete primary school, they were brought in and taught income-generating skills ranging from making and selling dried foods to tailoring and designing clothing, and even running small restaurants and more. So after visiting these two women's groups over several years, I had a flash. I reached out to everyone I knew, including Tamba and regional Peace Corps volunteers, and we organized a cross-generational women's summit. We brought together women of all ages from a half dozen communities across Mali. Many reported that they'd never been more than a few kilometers from home. They stayed with local host families, and over the course of 3 days, we facilitated sessions that, one at a time, gave each visiting delegation an opportunity to lead a session. Some shared ways to make a non-toxic mosquito repellent that was perfect for infants. Others gave advice on running a successful women's organization, including how to do dues, officers, and mission statements. And of course, the Markala women's groups, well, they shared their stories and advice too. The summit was so popular and well attended that, one, a local radio station transmitted and recorded the sessions, and two, we received messages from the groups that when they returned to their communities, there were a lot of men who wanted in on the next one. Now, this summit was a terrific, locally salient and locally controlled development initiative. African Sky and I, we didn't send in our experts to teach and organize the summit. We facilitated and funded a multi-day event in which women of all ages congregated to teach each other what they've been doing to make better lives for themselves and their families. And through an embedded anthropological approach, people who might otherwise be labeled as project people in need, well, they became true partners and leaders in the way all of us think and do development together. Okay, now let's step back from the field for just a moment and let's look at the theoretical origins of development anthropology. And probably the best place for us to start is with a guy named Robert Redfield. Now, Redfield was instrumental in shaping a subfield known as peasant studies, a term that has itself evolved into the anthropology of development. Now, His research approach reinforced the four-field tradition that Franz Boas laid as the foundation of anthropology. He blended cultural studies, biology, linguistics, and archaeology to collect data on poor rural farming societies. Redfield's career was launched by his work with Mexican immigrants in Chicago. Now, ruminating over the fact that these immigrants had lives in both the US and Mexico, his focus turned to what life is truly like in rural Mexican societies. So he went to Mexico in 1926 and in 1928 with hopes of finding the perfect community to study a poor rural farming society. And he found that community in a place called Tepoztlan. Now, Tepoztlan was a small agricultural community of family farmers. And it was here that Redfield developed two of his core concepts. There's the idea of the peasantry and the idea of the little community. Let's take a look at each. So, what is Redfield's peasantry? Well, he offers what he describes as a loose definition. He says the peasantry is a category or a type of pre-urban human society. And peasant society has a few requisite traits. First, peasants, they eat what they grow. They're farmers. Second, peasants, they don't treat land as capital or commodity. Instead, they follow traditional land tenure systems which can vary across cultures. In my primary Malian host village, families, they maintain their farming territory over the generations, only so long as they continue to cultivate them. A third characteristic of Redfield's peasant society is that it is rather powerless against the greater forces that surround it. He called this phenomenon the guidance of the peasantry from above. Now, last, this peasantry, it lives in a rural territory that is linked to the rest of the world through regional market towns. Now, the little community. Having identified the central features of peasant society, Redfield created the term the little community to help us grasp what life is like amongst the peasantry. Now, the little community, says Redfield, represents an earlier form of human society. It's small and culturally homogeneous, and daily life in the little community, it's structured by age and sex-based groups. Two other characteristics of the little community are that things kind of stay the same. One generation follows the next, living and working the same basic lives. And last, the little community is self-sufficient as an organic whole. Or in other words, the little community, it takes care of its people from birth to death. Redfield based these concepts on his observations in rural Mexico. But he taught that the little community was an essential unit of analysis for development anthropology around the world. In other words, his definition of the little community is dynamic enough to allow for meaningful and universal cross-cultural analysis. You can compare little communities across Mexico, Mali, and Madagascar for that matter. Now, despite the surface differences, Redfield challenged us to see their common condition. Now, and last, Redfield promoted participant observation as essential. For him, embedded participant observation was the only way to get at a community's whole, at their essence. But even beyond his important emphasis on participant observation, Redfield made terrific use of the interdisciplinarity of anthropology as a four-field discipline. And he continued to build upon the methods and ideas of his predecessors, inspiring new questions for new generations of anthropologists, scholars who continue, through anthropology, to test and correct the views of their predecessors. One of these scholars was Oscar Lewis. Now, Lewis, he revisited Tepoztlan, and in 1951, he published a revised account of this so-called little community. Now, his primary departure from Redfield was that, for him, the little community, both as Tepoztlan and as a universal unit of analysis, he says it wasn't a complete picture. First, this little community, he said, wasn't the primordially harmonious society that Redfield portrayed. And second, it wasn't intuitive. It wasn't an intuitive, self-sustaining community. Instead, it was tied to a complex network of regional and global forces. Like Mexican immigrants sending remittances home, the little community is anything but an insular, isolated place. And as such, the endemic poverty of the little community is a product of a system-wide failure, an economic system and history steeped in extreme inequality. Another anthropologist who built on Redfield's work was Sidney Mintz. His methodological innovation was to use anthropology to study commodities instead of communities. And this innovation has become a central thread in contemporary development anthropology. By examining coffee and sugar, for example, anthropological inquiry can now reveal the ties that Lewis identified as connecting little communities with the rest of the world. And Mintz's groundbreaking History of Sugar, Sweetness and Power, it's become a foundational text across the social sciences, history, ethnic studies, international business, and more. From the work of Redfield, Lewis, and Mintz, we can begin to articulate a mission for development anthropology. And this mission, it has three components. One, development anthropologists must embrace their role as agents of social change. I model this ethos today when I teach anthropology as a tool for social transformation. Two, development anthropologists should apply our unique four-field approach and our specializations to produce empirical and comprehensive development studies. Three, based on empirical field studies, development anthropologists should produce collective theories of development. Now, theories of development are not the exclusive domain of anthropologists. That said, most development anthropologists work within a common framework of ideas, and we call this framework development theory. Development theory is dynamic, not static, which means we can trace the evolution of certain key concepts within our overarching framework. And one of the most influential and frankly unfortunate of these concepts is the idea of the so-called third world. I mean, where exactly is that? When did this third world even start? I absolutely love how my mentor, Peter Brown, used the term majority world rather than third world. After all, the third world, the developing world, those living in poverty, are clearly the majority. They're not some distant, disconnected, third-degree population. They are literally the majority world. But then, how did we get this pervasive and insidiously deceptive term in the first place? Well, we go back to author Alfred Sauvy, who coined the term tiers monde, or third world, in 1952. From his Cold War perspective, Sauvy identified the third world as unallied regions that had yet to fully realize the capitalist mode of the United States, the first world, nor the socialist vision of the Soviet Union, the second world. Instead, these countries and their populations were territorial battlegrounds for the Cold War. Let me explain. One of my most important African studies teachers, Kofi Boehner-Hajer, once worked directly for Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of decolonized Ghana. Hajer explained that Nkrumah was masterful at playing the chess game, balancing US and Soviet interests towards his own advantage for his country. And by remaining unclaimed and unequally integrated into the first and second world economies, Nkrumah attempted to find Ghana its own unique and viable place in the global economy. But as Hajer always taught, in the Cold War, you either picked a lane, the first or the second world, or you got run over. And indeed, without getting into the thick of it, Nkrumah's Ghana fell. But how could that be? How could a global economy, one that has seen thousands of years of powerful empires across Africa and beyond, how could the world order shift so decidedly? Well, the global economic order that we're familiar with here in the first half of the 21st century has pretty shallow roots. roots that go back to 1944 and Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Emerging as a victor in 2 world wars, the U.S. had escaped the monstrous carnage of civil infrastructure of war-torn Europe and Asia. And as such, its relative power rose as the U.S. worked with the international community to organize and finance the rebuilding of the world and the modern global economy. So, at the Bretton Woods Conference, representatives from allied nations brokered the development for what became the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Basically, the idea was that first, the global economy would shift from the gold standard to the US dollar. And secondly, those countries with surplus, well, they would contribute funds that could be provided to countries that were struggling with deficits. One groovy world. The trouble is, just like a payday loan, there were strings attached if you took money from the World Bank. First, it's a loan. You're paying it back, and with interest. And to do that, your country must agree to a structural adjustment program, or in other words, to get this loan, you have to follow the rules. 1. You've got to agree to reduce existing budgets by cutting subsidies and social services across the board. Second, your country must eliminate trade and investment restrictions to spur exports and industry. And last, your country needs to devalue the local currency. That happened in Mali just before I arrived in 1994. Overnight, the value of local currency dropped in half. Why? Well, it brings in the outside money. Think of it this way. Local resources are now half price on the global market. And imports into your country, well, now they cost twice what they did yesterday. During the boom years of 1945 to 1969, this approach, it appeared to have some success. But since then, things haven't been so rosy. Global poverty endures, and arguably, the system that emerged out of Bretton Woods, it's undermining peace in our time. So what happened? Well, if you ask an anthropologist, we figured out that our principles of international development weren't as universal and objective as we once believed. To flesh that statement out, let's take a look at how development theory changed over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. And let's start with the modernization school. We attribute this theory to Walt Rostow, who articulated the 5 stages of economic growth. The modernization school asserts an evolutionary schema that places all world economies on a continuum from traditional to modern. The first of Rostow's 5 stages is the traditional collective economy, which corresponds quite well with Redfield's idea of the little community. And the way out of this primitive state is to enter the stage Rostow refers to as the preconditions for takeoff. And in this early phase, a society works out solutions for economic growth, but they're unsustainable. Then, with some careful planning and external investment, a country can move up to what Rostow calls the takeoff stage, where resistance to steady growth is finally overcome. In fact, it's what we come to expect. Economic growth, it becomes sustainable. So, for the modernization school, a takeoff economy, it's defined by the 10% rule. And that means that the investment and savings rate rises to around 10%. And as industry grows, more and more income is reinvested. The idea is that as incomes rise, people buy more food, homes, and swimming pools and all that stuff that makes us happy. And to do that, we'll need more and more food producers, house builders, and pool makers. So once an emerging economy achieves takeoff, it evolves into the penultimate stage, the drive to maturity. And Rostow notes that this is the stage that economic growth finally becomes automatic. It sticks. And it's that automatic, supposedly inevitable growth which leads to the pinnacle of economic development, the age of high mass consumption. Ultimately, modernization theory is all about getting traditional farming societies like the ones I work with in Mali to become high consumption societies. Basically, we're talking about getting Amazon Prime and iPhones to the furthest corners of Timbuktu. Development is about creating more consumers. And that's right in line with 19th century anthropology, an era dominated by the widespread presumption that Western cultures were the biological and cultural pinnacle of human evolution. Anthropologists, though, eventually grew critical of this presumption, and they updated our anthropological perspective of development. But why? Well, voices from the majority world, the third world, they were unequivocal. Why in the world would developing countries want to follow the West into the suffering and violence of the West's 20th century? Why follow the path that led to 2 world wars? Or consider the pervasive fear and conflict of the Cold War era. World wars and nuclear proliferation aside, in the US alone there's Vietnam, racial violence, and decades of civil unrest punctuated by the senseless assassinations of JFK, Martin Luther King, RFK, Malcolm X, and so many more. In response to all of this, critiques of modernization began to emerge in the 1960s and 70s. Scholar Andre Gunder Frank was one of several theorists who represented the post-modernization phase of development theory, what we'll call dependency theory. Frank and dependency theorists pointed out the inconsistencies of modernization theory. They presented the world economy as an exploitative network of metropolis-satellite relationships. And the cards are stacked against the so-called third world countries. They can't feasibly replicate the immeasurably costly arc that established the modern global economy. I mean, Africa can't enslave a foreign population to build a continental infrastructure for a new millennium. Another brand of dependency theory is known as underdevelopment. Now, this variation on dependency theory asserts that modernization actually produces underdeveloped societies. Scholar and activist Walter Rodney, he spoke for the developing world or majority world, and he wrote a book entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in which he eviscerated modernization theory. Specifically, Rodney examined the socioeconomic, historical, and cultural dynamics of the developing world, and he documented how development programs in the modernization tradition actually produced underdevelopment. He provided evidence for the colonial and post-colonial decline in the status of women in developing countries. He also pointed out that conventional development schemes of the West invested in places like Africa for the purpose of resource extraction, which produced pockets of development. There are schools, roads, and health clinics in the third world, but they're not universal. They're in pockets, benefits for the few, but at the cost of the many. So where are we today? How does development theory align with development practice in the 21st century? Development anthropologists may debate the specifics of development initiatives, but Redfield's instruction to embrace our role as agents for social change, that's what binds us all. And into the 21st century, development anthropologists are serving in government and non-government positions focused on articulating and achieving a global standard for international development. Today, this standard is largely reflected in the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted by the United Nations in 2000. These MDGs are a set of 8 goals that aim to reduce and then eliminate extreme poverty across the world, and in one generation, no less. It may be easy to doubt generational goals like the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, but the UN is measuring our progress on 8 vectors to plot the trajectory of progress in a very specific way. For example, the 3rd MDG promotes gender equality, and to measure country-by-country progress on this goal, the UN monitors real-world indicators like school enrollment numbers for girls and women's representation in national parliaments. And with tangible measurements like this, over time, maybe it's not such a far-fetched idea that we might eventually eradicate extreme poverty and hunger across the globe. After all, we've already worked through millennia of war, not to mention the Atlantic slave trade and colonization. So, call me an optimist, but I have my reasons. And one of them is that knowledge experts in the West are more open than we've ever been when it comes to learning from and working alongside the wise people of the majority world. Like anthropological pioneers, Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski, I vividly remember my first day in the village. Oh, that humbling day where, as a rookie field researcher, you viscerally feel the truth of cultural relativity. Boas, he looked amongst igloos as I looked at thatched roofs and adobe huts. And so very far from home, we both knew, deep down, that upon arrival, we'd become overgrown infants. Yet, we were tasked with learning everything, nearly from scratch. That's language, social structure, kinship, worldviews, daily lives, food production, socioeconomics, even local hopes and dreams. And I tell you, getting a crack at that rare opportunity, that chance to start anew, making sense of our lives and universe, that experience, it drives us field researchers. And I assure you, it's like reality Sudoku, but on a whole new level. Every puzzle or community we encounter is somewhat familiar, but each one is configured a little differently. So why would a rational person embrace such a complex, multidimensional living puzzle? Well, we do this because we're explorers of the human condition. We probe the nature of humankind over time and space. And by living both among and between multiple cultures, anthropologists find inspiration and answers to some of the great human questions, such as who are we and where do we come from? Boas, he was drawn to anthropology as a discipline because he was interested in the relationship between people and their environment. That's why he went to the Arctic. Right? He picked not just a far-off place, but he wanted a stark environment in which to probe the people-environment relationship. And when he did, he helped establish cultural relativity. You know, like those Sudoku boxes, structurally, there's something very similar going on. But each puzzle has its own unique patterns. And in human Sudoku, Boas helped us see how the uniqueness of cultures can be explained by environmental adaptation, not a predetermined biological structure. And that's what we're up to today. What's the relationship between culture and the environment? When we think about all of the intricacies that make natural systems operate, we lump them all into a single term, ecology. And as living and breathing beings, we're part of that ecology. We're part of the natural world. So, over the years, anthropologists have worked out ways to articulate this very thought. We're uniquely human, and we're not just part of the animal kingdom, we're part of the natural world. And just like ospreys collecting sticks, rodents, and fish to raise their young, our actions and lives, they literally reshape the environment around us. And that brings us to cultural ecology. Anthropologists who honed our complex relationship with the natural world, they eventually established a new theoretical thread in 20th century anthropology called cultural ecology. Cultural ecology examines the complex relations between people and their environment, and they distinguish themselves from other anthropological approaches with their collective adherence to two big cultural ecology ideas. First, they argue that the natural environment sets certain possibilities from which people and cultures may choose. And second, this blend of naturally inspired possibilities plus the element of human choice, well, that challenged the idea of environmental determinism, the idea that cultural differences are environmentally determined. So rather than environmental determinism, cultural ecology asserts environmental possibilism. Julian Stewart finished his anthropology PhD in 1929 at UC Berkeley under the tutelage of Alfred Kroeber. Stewart, the first anthropology lecturer at the University of Michigan, taught at a handful of universities, but for a decade in his mid-career, he applied his talents to the Bureau of American Ethnology, otherwise known as the Bureau of Ethnology. Established by Congress in 1879, the BAE mission was to collect and curate all records and materials relating to Native Americans. You see, up until then, Native American ethnology was the domain of the Interior Department. The BAE, they had the task of bringing those records and programs to the Smithsonian Institution, which opened the National Museum of the American Indian some 125 years later in 2004. Stewart, he was an excellent choice for the BAE because he had a rather unique approach to anthropology. You see, Stewart, he wasn't just an empirical purist, but he did privilege environmental factors and the collection of material artifacts over the use of human informants. He understood cultural evolution as multilineal, meaning culturally, we're all on our own path. He explained that no singular force determines the course of cultural evolution, not biology and not environment. Rather, it's things like environment, economy, social organization, political systems, technology, and ideologies. They all influence cultural evolution. One of Stewart's most replicated anthropological approaches was to empirically examine human societies by focusing on what he called its culture core. What does that mean? Well, he advised would-be field researchers to investigate subsistence strategies within a given culture. His idea was that as these dynamic strategies evolve over time, those changes would influence other cultural features like language and social organization. So if we focus on what people do to make a living more than what they say or think, according to cultural ecologists, we'll produce more useful analyses. Analyses grounded in the material daily lives of our study communities. Now, Stewart and his cultural ecology profoundly influenced mid-20th century anthropology. And like his academic grandfather, Franz Boas, the graduate students Stewart trained are a veritable who's who of 20th century anthropology. To name a few, there's Sidney Mintz, Eric Wolf, Elman Service, and Marvin Harris, who we'll hear from in just a bit. But back to Stewart. One of the more remarkable distinctions of his brand of anthropology research was his openness to new ideas and data. And by the end of his career, he basically advocated the idea of changing your mind as an anthropological method in and of itself. And I quote, "As I re-examine some of my own cross-cultural formulations, I note a long history of changing my mind." And he adds, "There are perhaps others who should also change their minds from time to time." And indeed, over time, his students and others continued changing their minds. Following Stewart, his widely influential thread of anthropology grew into new ideas and methods. First, in the 1950s, cultural ecology remained close to Stewart's approach. Simply put, it focused on investigating and documenting the intersection of culture, technology, environment, and human behavior. But into the 1960s, we begin to see an ecosystem approach as illustrated by the work of Robert Netting. Now, this new layer added concepts like caloric expenditure and the carrying capacity of human habitats. Moving further into the century, Stewart's prolific student, Marvin Harris, took his teacher's methods to the extreme, presuming that all cultural elements stem from human adaptations to environmental pressures. Now, this extreme materialist explanation for cultural evolution, it elicited heated debates from the growing numbers of more interpretivist and postmodern anthropologists of the late 20th century. Nonetheless, Stewart remains a seminal influence on the way we understand the cultural change and dynamic relationship between culture and the environment. In 2003, the American Anthropological Association initiated the Julian Stewart Award to celebrate new books that carry forth his cultural ecology legacy. In 2009, for example, anthropologist David Crawford was given this prestigious prize. A modern take on the cultural ecology approach, Crawford's Moroccan Households in the World Economy examined Berber social relations and inequality through the lens of local modes of production and reproduction. So let's return to the golden age of cultural ecology to visit two more anthropologists who embraced Stewart's approach. First, the graduate advisor of my graduate advisor, Robert Netting. Inspired by Stewart's work on Great Basin hunter-gatherer societies in North America, Netting took off for some field research of his own to see if Stewart's ecological approach would work for a small-scale agricultural society. His project led to the 1968 ethnography, Hill Farmers of Nigeria. And in this terrific cultural ecology classic, Netting documented some brilliant farmers in northern Nigeria who cultivated terraced fields all year round using organic fertilizers like manure and compost. Netting, he reinforced core elements of cultural ecology. First and foremost, he opposed cultural and environmental determinism. Like his teacher, Netting focused mainly on quantitative data. Rather than exploring the inner lives and folklore of his study community, he liked to hone in on the things he could observe and measure. Things like the farming calendar, work activities, diet, tools, technological know-how, and local production levels by household and by unit of land. There was more, but you get the picture. That said, he explained that sociocultural factors, not just biology and the material world, are essential pieces of any anthropological puzzle. Time and time again, Netting returned to West Africa, where his enduring contribution was to systematically and quantitatively explore the social and ecological consequences of long-term resource use. And through a comparative historical approach, married with empiricism and cross-cultural perspectives, Netting emerged as a champion of the small-scale farmer. His work, it celebrates the small-scale family farmers as champions who manage to feed families in the face of economic and ecological scarcity. He was awarded a Guggenheim and was elected by his scientific peers to the National Academy of Sciences. Netting, like his cultural ecology contemporaries Roy Rappaport and John Bennett, were heavily influenced and inspired by the anthropologist whose name has become synonymous with cultural ecology, Julian Stewart. Another one of Stewart's most influential students is Marvin Harris. Now, Harris doubled down on Stewart's empiricism. In fact, he went as far as taking Stewart's environmental possibilism into strict environmental determinism. The short of it is that Harris argued that our sociocultural lives, they arise out of our subsistence practices. And in essence, he was saying that all aspects of our culture, from our mode of production to religion and ideology, they all originate from the way we eke out a living from our surrounding environment. According to Harris, differences in cultural elements like musical styles and art, believe it or not, are rooted in differences in the way we make a living. I first came across Marvin Harris in high school via his popular press book, Our Kind. And as I flipped through those pages, Harris exposed me to ways of life I had never heard of. And I remember being fascinated by the scores of cultures that he discussed from all over the world. I mean, Harris, he was a brilliant raconteur who was a master at drawing cross-cultural connections. But his work was a lot different from people like Julian Stewart. Harris, by focusing exclusively on the material lives of his subjects, he eschewed subjective accounts and human informants. Instead, he stuck to the material world. In the famous piece on Sacred Cattle of India, he laid bare his approach. If you go to India and ask locals why so many Indians refuse to eat cows, even in the presence of hunger, the answer would be telling. They'd say that cattle are sacred and must not be slaughtered for human feed. But that didn't cut it for Harris. Harris was a strict materialist trying to make sense of why people do the things they do. Now, there's not a scientific measure for sacred or non-sacred bovines. So, as such, Harris, he rejects this explanation. Sure, people say that the taboo of eating cattle is based on religious practice, but Harris doesn't buy that. He argued there are other deeper things afoot in this Angus avoidance. Rather than talking with and interviewing people, Harris analyzed pre-existing quantitative data. He didn't even go to India. Instead, he crunched some numbers and revealed that the sacred cow may be more of an economic taboo than a religious one. In short, he showed how cattle are far more valuable alive than butchered. You see, in the Indian economy, cattle are far more valuable as producers of milk, offspring, and dung, rather than ground beef and steak cutlets. Cattle dung, for example, is used for organic fertilizer or fuel for cooking. And yeah, I know, cooking on cow dung briquettes, it doesn't sound so appetizing, but Harris crunched the numbers, and he found that cattle provided more economic benefits when they're alive. He wasn't arguing against religious explanations for this taboo. That just wasn't his concern. But he was demonstrating that religious explanations and all other cultural elements have deep, deep roots in our material and productive lives. Most certainly, Harris and his approach are connected to cultural ecology and the Julian Stewart tradition, but his strict materialist perspective was a sharp diversion that eventually required its own name. Harris branded his theory and methods cultural materialism. Cultural materialism, he said, explains how our political, economic, domestic, and even the ideological and symbolic dimensions of society are ultimately rooted in how we meet our basic biological needs. Cultural materialism, as we'll see, reveals our common humanity despite the vast surface-level cultural diversity of the human family. The basic methodology is to, 1, focus on the observable and quantifiable, period. 2, when you do research, embrace the scientific method. You need to develop methods and analyze your empirical data in testable and correctable ways. Your methods and analysis must be replicable. And last, using your empirical data, reduce cultural phenomena like religion or political organization into observable, measurable variables for cross-cultural comparisons. Let's nail this idea down a bit by taking a look at Harris's pyramid of cultural materialism. Now, always keep in mind, first and foremost, Harris starts with the environment, and then he builds cultural systems up from there. From square one, everything a society does is based on its environment. So by building Harris's pyramid, we can actually build a culture. So step one, we need to satisfy our basic human needs. That is the base of our pyramid, our infrastructure. So as a society, we need to look around us and figure out how to make a living. How are we going to fulfill our basic needs? If we're born on Baffin Island, we'd be wise to work out how to build shelters, fish, and hunt, because that'll be our mode of production. Now, all we need to finish our infrastructure is our mode of reproduction. We need to work out, based on our Arctic island, our population dynamics. You know, with limited resources, this island isn't capable of hosting large urban-level populations. Instead, we'll keep our population small, yet viable. And that is our infrastructure, our modes of production and reproduction. Once we work out how to take care of those, we can then move on to build the next layer of our cultural pyramid, the structure. Now, the structure level is where we take care of our domestic and political economies. Our domestic economy includes how we organize our families, gender and age roles, and even kinship. This middle level, the structure, it also contains our political economy, in which we work out things like class structure, political organization, and trade. And then finally, when we work all of that out, we get to the apex of the pyramid, the superstructure. With our basic needs met in the infrastructure, we built our domestic and political systems, right? So now we can turn to cultural elements like art, literature, music, dance, rituals, religion, science, more, whatever. And now that we have our cultural materialism pyramid, let's start at the top and reverse engineer two cultures. A cattle herder in West Africa, right, is unlikely to become a world-class sailor. Why? Well, it's because he comes from a society or culture that doesn't build sailing-friendly economies